Welcome back to Assassin's Creed, the complete story. For today's lesson into the lore that is Assassin's Creed, we're going to be covering Edward Kenway. He's a rather interesting character in the Assassin's Creed lore, as he was never trained to be an assassin and just seems to have fallen into it. Did you like this new take on the main character of the game, or were you looking for another character who was following the creed that they grew to love? All information has been gathered from playing the game and reviewing it on the wiki to get our facts straight. Edward was born in Wales to Bernard and Lynette, and it was when he turned the age of 10 that his family relocated to Bristol in the southwest of England. When he was 17 years old, he met with Caroline Scott, a woman who was 2 years older than him, and within a year, they were married. During their first year, she became pregnant, but not even she knew about it at this time. Edward continued to have grand ideas about sailing as a privateer to become rich and famous, and eventually, he left his wife to make enough money for them to live on. Initially, he was only supposed to be gone for a year, but quickly his adventure grew. It was after he left that Caroline learned that she was pregnant, but instead of telling him, she chose to keep this from Edward until he returned, because she didn't think he was coming back. Initially, before the start of Assassin's Creed 4, Edward pursued his dreams of being a privateer by joining with a ship chartered by Benjamin Hornigold. But once the conflict between the major empires had ended, Edward found himself on the wrong side of the law, as privateers became pirates due to a lack of work. It was in 1715 that we entered into the beginning of Assassin's Creed 4, and Edward's pirate ship was attacking a passing vessel. It was due to being outmatched and in a heavy storm that Edward found himself shipwrecked on an island. Next to him was the injured assassin, Duncan Walpole. Duncan offered to pay Edward to escort him to the nearby Havana. But when Edward demanded payment up front, Duncan got nervous and tried to shoot at Edward before fleeing to the nearby forest. Eventually, Edward caught up and killed Duncan, taking his robes and all of his belongings. Edward's adventures would have ended there, if not for a letter in Duncan's bags that invited him to the governor's office and stated that they would recognize him by his clothes, as they didn't know his face. The letter stated that Duncan was to defect to the Templar Order by delivering a crystal cube. Obviously always looking for a quick buck, Edward took the crystal and headed for Havana by hitching a ride on a local merchant ship. Once he managed to get himself to the fort, he found himself being inducted into the Templar Order as the traitor assassin Duncan Walpole by the local Templar leader, Governor Torres. While keeping up the charade, Edward learns that the Templars are looking for the first civilization site called the Observatory. The Templars are looking for the observatory because they believed it would allow them to monitor anyone in the world and learn all of their secrets. Still not getting his pay though, Edward was brought to the docks the next day to escort a man known as the Sage. The Templars believed that the Sage knew of the location of the observatory and wanted to question him. All would have gone as planned except for the fact that the assassins tried to interfere, causing Edward to kill many of them to ensure that the Templars didn't lose the Sage. Thanking Edward, Torres finally pays him for his trouble, but it was a measly 1,000 reals. Disheartened, Edward decided he needed a better way to make money. It was then that it dawned on Edward, something that would allow you to see where anyone in the world was and their deepest secrets. Someone would pay huge for that information. The only man who knew where it was the Sage. So Edward tried to break back into the Templar base and get the information from the Sage. But this time, it was a little too easy to break back in, and the Templars wanted to know, who was Edward Kenway, since they figured out he wasn't exactly Duncan Walpole. Torres had Edward locked up on a Spanish ship, set to sail back to London, where Edward would answer for his crimes to the Templar headquarters. This, my friends, is where the story of Edward Kenway turns from a simple pirate wannabe into the almighty pirate badass that we know and love. You see, locked up in this ship, awaiting what would sure be his death at the hands of the Templars, he met Adewale. And they broke free from their bonds and were soon in control of the ship with a crew of released prisoners. After escaping the storm that created a perfect distraction, Captain Edward Kenway was just that, captain of the Jackdaw and officially a pirate. Some time passed with Edward in control of his own ship. During this time, he would introduce Adewale to fellow pirates Edward Thatch, James Kidd, and Benjamin Hornigold. He would then free the British-controlled town of Nassau, and with the help of his fellow pirates, they created the Pirate Republic. Everything was going fine for our pirate captain, until James Kidd asked about the Sage and the observatory that Edward spoke of so frequently. He then told Edward to meet him back at Tulum, where he would learn more. It was here that Edward found the assassin's base and learned that James Kidd was in fact an assassin also. It was explained that when the assassins came to the area, they worked with the Mayans as they shared similar beliefs and goals. While unhappy that Edward killed so many assassins, Kidd convinced the assassins to give Edward a shot since he had the sense. It was then that Edward found out why Kidd had brought him to this island to begin with. On the island was a statue of a face that Edward confirmed was that of the sage that he had delivered to the Templars. But the statue was at least 100 years old. To understand how the sage could look like this statue that was so old, Edward knew he would have to find the sage himself and the observatory. A few more adventures happened for Edward while he was tracking down the sage, and he learned that his real name was Roberts. During this time, Edward would try to help Nassau by getting the medicines with Blackbeard, and he would learn that James Kidd is actually a woman masquerading as a man. He would then stop the blockade of Nassau and eventually found himself at Blackbeard's retirement, which would be Blackbeard's final stand. Sadly, Blackbeard wouldn't walk away from the final conflict, but before he would go, he would inform Edward of a man named Roberts who was currently working on a slaver ship. Edwards convinced Vane to team up with him so that they could go find the location of the observatory together. They launched a successful combined attack against the slaver ship and managed to learn that Roberts served on the ship called Princess and that it regularly docked at Kingston. But just as they were going to set sail for Kingston and catch Roberts, they found themselves surrounded by Captain Jack Rackham and Vane's crew mutinying. So that the mutinying crew could take Vane's ship, they marooned Edward and Vane on a nearby island and sailed away. No one knew that Edward was there, not even his crew, as he had left them back in Nassau so that he could travel here with Vane. So how did he get off the island? Maybe he used 2 sea turtles strapped to his feet? Well, you're gonna have to wait until the next time to find out. Join us by subscribing to the channel, following us on Twitter and Facebook and Google+, and keep in touch. We wouldn't mind a postcard or two if you go on vacations.